Hello, I'm Mark Milstein, Clinical Professor of Management and Director of the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell University. Since 2003, the center has engaged in applied research, teaching, and engagement focused on business opportunities that come from addressing social and environmental issues through innovation and entrepreneurship. On behalf of the center, I want to welcome you to the 12th annual Cornell Energy Connection, Cornell's premier energy event featuring industry leaders who share their perspectives on key issues impacting today's energy sector. We organize this event in collaboration with students from Cornell's Energy Club. And I want to give a special thanks today to Nikita Menrel, who was in charge of creating today's session. Also, I want to thank both my center colleagues, Associate Director Monica Twinar and Center Coordinator Sophia Abdulhamid for all their efforts. Finally, thank you to our colleagues at eCornell for enabling this virtual event. Also, of course, I want to thank this year's sponsors of the Cornell Energy Connection, including Chevron, Con Edison, and Distributed Sun. Before we get started, Cornell wants to acknowledge that the Ithaca campus of the university is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, also known as the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, the state of New York, and even the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayakono disposition and honor the ongoing connection of the people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Last week, CEC began with an interesting discussion about the role and future of natural gas in the energy mix in the face of growing climate change concerns. Today, we turn our attention to hydrogen. Right now, I want to turn things over to Nikita to introduce today's session. Nikita?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. As nations come forward with net zero strategies to align with their international climate targets, hydrogen has once again risen up on everyone's agenda. It is the lightest, most abundant element in the universe and contains more energy than fossil fuels. But for every potential transformative application of hydrogen, there are unique challenges that must be overcome. And so in today's panel, I'm looking forward to hear more on the big questions around the hydrogen economy and the extent to which it could actually help the world avoid climate change. So let me start by introducing our amazing panel moderator, Paul Mutolo. Paul is our in-house expert in electrochemical hydrogen materials and systems, especially hydrogen fuel cells. He is the co-founder and CEO of the Standard Hydrogen Corporation and the executive director of the Center for Alkaline-Based Energy Solutions at Cornell University. He's also a founding board member of the New York Battery and Energy Storage Technology Consortium. And now I invite Paul to take over and introduce our panelists for today.
Thank you so much, Nikita. It's really great to be here with everyone and help start off this discussion. I'm really excited that as part of the Cornell Energy Connection this year, hydrogen and especially renewable hydrogen is being showcased as one of the topics. I'm really happy to be here with this panel of excellent people. It's not often that you get to host a discussion with such colleagues that have such great track records in the space, and also whom I'm really lucky to have known many of for many years. I wanted to start off just with framing the discussion around what it is actually that we're going to be discussing today, because there are 2 aspects. It's both hydrogen and then how it's used. I have some slides to help showcase this, and this comes from the Department of Energy and a concept that they have been working on over the last number of years called H2 at scale. And it captures the fact that hydrogen is really both an energy carrier and that there are many technology options for how to extract that energy in that energy carrier mode. So this first slide is really busy and it touches on many different ways that hydrogen interacts with our energy system. I'm going to zoom in really quickly and focus on a couple of aspects. I think mostly when people start to think about hydrogen, they may have heard about fuel cell vehicles or other clean transportation modes that can use fuel cells. And that's certainly one aspect of where hydrogen is already having an impact in the market, but it's not at all the only one. There are other places that people are there are other places where hydrogen is already used today heavily in terms of making ammonia, making metals like steel and other places across the chemical industry. Of course, petroleum reformation involves a lot of hydrogen. And looking at the ways that we can change the energy footprint of those parts of our energy system is a lot of the discussion these days about what kinds of hydrogen we use and what processes we use to do those conversions. The other side that people are probably more familiar with is the electric grid itself and power generation, as well as energy storage, and the multiple of ways that hydrogen can interact with that system. And it's important to remember that that system itself is changing as we move away from fossil fuels as the mode of baseload power and into a mode of more renewable power like solar and wind. So to help us really further explore all of these different aspects of how hydrogen can fit in our energy system, the Cornell Energy Connection team has assembled this fantastic panel of folks. And I'm happy to go through and help them introduce each other before we get into some questions. So first off, happy to introduce Katrina. I've known you for the longest and I just goofed it. Katrina Fritz, who is Executive Director of the Stationary Fuel Cell Collaborative. And Katrina, I'm happy to let you start off with a few comments of introduction as we go around the room.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. As Paul mentioned, I work with the stationary fuel cell industry, academia, other coalitions, consortiums, both broadly in clean energy and in the hydrogen and fuel cell space. My work focuses on state level clean energy policy, distributed energy resource planning and policy. I've also worked with the European Commission on their hydrogen and fuel cell programs. And so I'm really excited to be able to talk today really about how far we've come and some of the external input that is coming into the industry from places like Cornell, and how we are moving to that greener, cleaner future, including hydrogen in the broader portfolio of solutions.
Great, thank you, Katrina. Also on our panel today is Tanya Peacock. Tanya is also a Cornell degree holder, and she is representing Bloom Energy, who many of us probably heard about as one of the fuel cell technology providers in the space. She is the Senior Director of Government Affairs and Policy for Bloom Energy.
Hi, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Nikita and the Cornell Energy Club for having me today. Very, very exciting to be here, particularly as a Cornell alum. So I manage the policy team for Bloom Energy, focusing on California and the Western US, and policy and government affairs to develop, it's essentially interconnected to make sure that fuel cells and hydrogen, green hydrogen, can play a key role in helping California and the US more broadly, actually globally, provide solutions for clean energy and climate goals, to provide resiliency and reliability, and also with respect to hydrogen, to be able to provide a really key decarbonization technology that can help with hard to abate sectors. So I'm excited for the conversation today to talk about fuel cells and reliable clean electricity and hydrogen and how they all work together to help meet energy and climate goals. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tanya. And rounding out our panel of experts today is Dr. John Stevens. Dr. John Stevens is a senior management consultant for an organization that we know as E3, which is Energy and Environmental Economics. John.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to the Cornell Energy Connection. So I work at Energy and Environmental Economics. I wear a lot of different hats there, but I, in particular, work
I may have lost John's audio. At least I don't hear John. Okay, so I think John has an audio challenge at the moment. I think he's going to be coming back with us in a second or two with a connection. And so we'll get back to having John finish his introduction as soon as his audio connection gets a little more stable. In the meantime, I think we can start our discussion. And John, if you'll give me the high sign, or I know the organizers can give me the high sign too when John gets his audio back so we can have him continue introducing himself. But let's dive right in and start talking about some of these aspects about hydrogen. There are so many different places, again, where it can fit in our energy system. There are different applications, some of which we will have a potential to get our hands on directly as consumers, and others of which may be very far behind the scenes and we don't get a chance to see directly, but will hopefully have a very positive, if indirect, impact on our energy system. Katrina, I'd like to start with you. As I mentioned, we've known each other for a long time. You've been working in this hydrogen space in different capacities for companies and for the collaborative you are representing now, as well as other places in between. And so I thought we'd start off with knowing that one of the things you're focused on these days is policy and regulation around hydrogen and fuel cells. I wonder if you can comment on how you think that the recently signed Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is staging to potentially change the way that hydrogen will roll out into our energy system here in the United States.
Thank you, Paul. There was an unprecedented level of support for hydrogen and subsequently fuel cells in this act that was signed earlier this week. $9.5 billion direct funding for various hydrogen programs. So $8 billion of that is for what they are calling hydrogen hubs. The concept is to prove out hydrogen technology in different sectors, so producing hydrogen from different sources, distributing and transporting it, and using it in different sectors. And because it's US DOE funding, I think it's likely that it's going to be in different regions of the country as well. So diversifying what will be demonstrated in this program will be key. It really is a lot of funding. The language calls for at least 4 hubs. Because it's $8 billion, I would also anticipate probably more than 4 hubs. I think they'll get quite a few applications. There's been a lot of different entities in the country working in this space for a long time. This concept is really similar to something that has already begun in the European Union. Through their European Commission funding, they have hydrogen valleys. So they have already started to produce hydrogen from renewable resources, to inject it into the pipeline, to transport it by trucks, to demonstrate on-road vehicles and buses. And ultimately, they, like us, through this infrastructure bill, would like to address grid resilience and reliability also on the electric generation side. So we have also, in the US, now started a $1 billion clean electrolysis program. So as Paul showed in his graphic, producing hydrogen from those renewable resources. So this is $1 billion for demonstration, commercialization, and deployment of the system. So I think the deployment piece in commercialization is also interesting. So it's not strictly an R&D program through the DOE. There's also clean hydrogen manufacturing and recycling. That's $50 million to support the clean hydrogen supply chain. They will be growing, I believe, and reforming the DOE's hydrogen office. It used to be the Fuel Cell Technologies Office, I think, many years ago, and it's evolved. But it has to grow because they're going to be managing and supporting a lot of these new programs and in interacting with a lot of other agencies with crossover. There will be the creation of a clean hydrogen strategy and roadmap, which is very necessary for us to map to all of these various global climate objectives and national climate objectives to make sure the strategies are aligned. And a very interesting piece is that there will be clean hydrogen production qualification. So this will direct the establishment of a carbon intensity standard. So a lot of the discussion, and I know a lot of the students were interested in the topic of the colors of hydrogen. How clean is hydrogen? How green is hydrogen coming from different resources? The establishment of this standard, I think, is a very good piece of the legislation. So it will set a minimum requirement for the carbon intensity of the hydrogen, forcing it to be clean, and it will also set a federal standard that can be viewed by the states because the states have been deciding how to address this as well. And I think we can talk more about this throughout this discussion in the next hour. Beyond this direct hydrogen support, the Act has support for a lot of areas where fuel cells are already being used today, but not at scale. So ports, ferries, buses, heavy-duty long-haul vehicles, areas that are difficult to electrify. And as I said, grid resilience and grid reliability are huge issues, not just in California. We heard a lot starting 3 years ago about power shutoffs in California, but we've experienced massive outages in the upper Midwest and Texas and the Northeast as well in the past few years, and they seem to be more frequent. So that will be an interesting opportunity for the fuel cell for electric generation side.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, certainly on the last point, here in the New York region, one of the activities that New York Best has been so engaged in is the so-called REV initiative, which is Reforming the Energy Vision, which is supposed to help all the utilities across the state understand how their mode of operation will be changing as we need to move to a much more resilient grid, as well as a much more renewable grid. And a lot of that was motivated by Hurricane Sandy, which knocked out big parts of downstate New York for many, many days. So great points there. Following up on some of the aspects you shared, I want to turn it over to Tanya for a moment. So Tanya, Bloom Energy, as many of our listeners might know, has a pretty unique fuel cell technology offering that can run on both natural gas or hydrogen, or I believe blends of the both. Can you elaborate on the points made that Katrina introduced about this color scheme of different kinds of hydrogen, and whether that system makes sense for communicating all the differences that it's trying to convey? How do the impacts of hydrogen vary depending on how it's generated, and then maybe also a little bit about how it's used? But is that color scheme enough to try to capture that complexity?
Sure. I would say that the color scheme is actually quite confusing, and it's not applied consistently between different countries. So, for example, clean hydrogen in the EU is defined as not being produced from fossil fuels. The definition of clean hydrogen that in the infrastructure bill that Katrina just mentioned is defined as produced with a carbon intensity equal to or less than 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. Green hydrogen has different definitions depending upon where it's being used. In California, green electrolytic hydrogen is defined in statute as being produced from grid power. In other places, it's presumed to be produced from 100% renewable power. Then we have blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced from fossil fuels, natural gas primarily, with carbon capture. There's turquoise sometimes is thrown out, and that's if the carbon is actually utilized for another purpose. And then there's pink, you may have heard, from nuclear, all to say that it's all quite confusing and not particularly consistent or helpful, I think, in communicating the different types of hydrogen production and what the impact. So I'll actually just step back for a second in terms of the two types of hydrogen production really in use today are the reforming of natural gas and coal, and then there's electrolysis, which is creating hydrogen by splitting running electricity through water and separating the two hydrogen atoms from the oxygen atom. And today, and then in terms of use, most of the hydrogen in use today is used for fertilizer production and oil refining. It's quite an established, very large market. And in this market, 96% of the hydrogen comes from fossil fuels. So that's an overview of the primary production and use scenarios that are in place today. And then when we're looking at the relative carbon intensities, I think it's interesting to look at what those are. So the carbon intensity of electrolytic hydrogen is very dependent upon the carbon intensity of the electricity. So if it's coming directly from wind or solar, then it's zero carbon. essentially. If it's coming from grid power, then it depends on the carbon intensity of the grid. So if you're looking at the U.S. average grid, the average CI carbon intensity on the U.S. grid, electrolytic hydrogen actually has a carbon intensity of 21 kilograms per CO2 of hydrogen. 21 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. So that's actually quite high. And then when you look at, in comparison, hydrogen produced from steam methane reformation of natural gas, it is actually between 8 and 12 kilograms. And even coal gasification is between 18 and 20, and this is without carbon capture. So in the near term, actually, if you're looking at hydrogen production in terms of what's the most carbon effective in reducing carbon emissions, you might think that, steam methane reformation of fossil fuels with carbon capture, perhaps that is one of the most carbon effective approaches. But most studies looking at deep decarbonization studies very much look to electrolytic hydrogen over the long term as the cleaner and lower cost pathway. But it's very important that the electric grid keeps getting cleaner, and then hydrogen supplies will get cleaner as well. And so in the U.S. infrastructure bill, judging from the numbers I just cited for perspective, 2 kilos of CO2 produced per kilogram of hydrogen is actually quite low. And that's significant and will contribute significantly to hydrogen's ability to help meet clean energy and climate goals. And so I do think this is very much a step in the right direction in terms of the approach to communicating the carbon benefits of hydrogen. And I'm hoping that states there's an effort to define hydrogen in various state legislatures. And I'm hoping that they will adopt the carbon intensity approach and we can start to move away from the colors. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was such a rich area to explore in a lot of detail. Thanks for giving us a good overview of it. John, we have a question for you, but before we jump into that question, it's a great segue into a couple of things Tanya was mentioning about decarbonization and how we consider that. But let me come back to that question after we let you continue your introduction, because I know we had an audio hiccup there.
Sure. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'll just start from the top. So my name is John Stevens. I am a senior managing consultant at Energy and Environmental Economics Incorporated. I work on multiple different subjects there, but one of them in particular is how to use hydrogen and synthetic fuels for decarbonization of the transportation and electricity sectors, as well as other sectors. Prior to that, I worked at the U.S. Department of Energy in the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office as a project manager for the H2 at Scale initiative that Paul initially introduced. And prior to that, I completed my PhD in mechanical engineering at UC Berkeley.
Great. Thanks, John. So as part of your role at E3, as we think more about the potential for hydrogen to be one of the vectors that we use to begin to decarbonize the energy system, I wonder if in your working with different clients, in your analysis for them, how do you model all that complexity? Or maybe I'd take a step back from the complexity. How do you model hydrogen generally in terms of evaluating different decarbonization pathways that are out there? Is hydrogen already being part of that analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for reference, we work with a lot of different clients, typically looking at how to decarbonize maybe an individual sector, such as the power generation sector, or for these pathways analyses, the entire economy to some level by some period. We typically consider hydrogen, and specifically electrolytic hydrogen or green hydrogen, as a means to decarbonize sectors where you really need some sort of fuel. And there's a number of different ways in which one might require a fuel. So for the electricity sector, we typically think of it as a means of providing power that can be turned on when you have an insufficient supply of, say, solar or wind power, in order to keep the total cost of the electricity sector down. And that's been kind of shown across many different studies that getting to, say, 70 or 80% decarbonization is relatively straightforward with wind, solar, and short-duration lithium-ion batteries. But if you want to go beyond that level, you really need some sort of power that can be turned on when needed. And we really see hydrogen as one of the potential options, including things like nuclear, CCS, or some other form of long-duration energy storage. Turning to other sectors, really, we tailor our analyses to where we're doing the analysis for, right? So if you're in a jurisdiction that has a lot of manufacturing, a lot of heavy transportation, or potentially some very large winter heating needs, then you might consider using hydrogen in these applications, knowing that hydrogen is likely to be more expensive than if you could just directly electrify a resource using that wind and solar power in the first place. But in certain applications, it really is going to work. And so some specific sectors we might consider would be long-distance trucking, the aforementioned, oil refining and ammonia production sectors, different applications for high-temperature heat that might be used in industrial processes, as well as generally, if you have a large, for instance, aviation fleet, and you don't have enough biofuel supply, you might consider using hydrogen to generate synthetic jet fuel and doing that. And so that could particularly be important if, for instance, a large portion of your overall emissions comes from the transportation sector. So in whole, it really depends, but our logic is there's certain systems for which you really need a fuel, and hydrogen or fuels derived from hydrogen and carbon neutral CO2 is a really good way to ensure that we can continue to keep the reliability and energy services provided by our economy while reducing its emissions.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that's a really great way, I think, to summarize those different places where it can map onto the energy system today, and how to start to prioritize some of those in terms of the corollary to a fuel and how to move that around. That brings us maybe an opportunity to step back for a moment for people in our audience that maybe aren't as familiar with hydrogen technology and fuel cell technology. I wonder if I can put out there a question about how the basics of hydrogen compare to, for example, gasoline and natural gas, both on an energy basis, but also on like a safety and a flammability basis, and then maybe moving into, back into applications. Katrina, do you want to take a first stab at that? And we'll see if anyone else has an additional comment.
Sure. So I can, start kind of with the basics with respect to safety. So the Department of Energy has been conducting research, development, and demonstration of fuel cell systems running off of hydrogen in the vehicle sector and the electric generation sector for many, many years. As some of you are aware, the auto industry, the very large OEMs like Toyota, Hyundai, General Motors have invested in fuel cells and hydrogen. So there has been extensive safety testing for any system that is on the road, as well as on the electric generation side. Any of the backup power systems, say from Plug Power, which is located in New York, and some of the other PEM systems out of other countries, those have all gone through standard UL testing, certifications. They go through seismic testing for earthquakes. They go through fireproof testing. They have to do every kind of testing that anything that would be situated at a telecommunications site goes through. Specific to hydrogen fuel itself, they have already passed the fire safety tests of those wherever they're installed of the local fire and permitting. They are waived from any required permits from air quality districts or any state level or municipal level environmental protection groups. Hydrogen is non-toxic, it's non-poisonous, and it is environmentally benign if a leak does occur. So it's a gas, but release of it doesn't contribute to atmospheric or water pollution. It's not a greenhouse gas. All fuels are flammable, and hydrogen is less flammable in the air and less explosive in the air than natural gas or gasoline. So, when hydrogen burns up versus out as well, that there's a famous video you can find on YouTube, I'm pretty sure, or the internet, showing pictures of hydrogen burning up from a tailpipe. And so it is lighter than air. And the stationary power systems use hydrogen that's pressurized to less than 3,000 psi, which is and often to the industry standard of 2,400 psi. So it has a pretty small footprint, and again, it doesn't necessarily have to go through all of the permitting, both environmental and from a safety perspective, of some of the alternate fossil fuels that might be used on site, like with the diesel generator. And for more information on this topic, there is a Hydrogen Safety Center. And that one's easy to find. It's literally called the Center for Hydrogen Safety on the internet. And they have a lot of resources, information on hydrogen. It's very helpful. I found it to be a good resource.
That's a great tip. Yes, I visited that website myself before, and they have a lot of information out there, and categorized it, made it quite accessible depending on what you're interested in. That's really helpful. I know in discussions I've had before with people in the past, as a chemist, a lot of times people ask me about the energy content. And one of the ways that we describe that is that 1 kilogram of hydrogen, if you could hold a bucket of 1 kilogram of hydrogen, that's about the same energy content as 1 gallon of gasoline, which on the electric side, inherent in the fuel, is about 34 kilowatt hours in that one bucket. So it's a pretty dense fuel in terms of its energy. John or Tanya, do you have any other follow-ups on the general hydrogen safety or comparisons there that didn't get touched on? We have a good segue, if not, over to Tanya regarding how hydrogen fits in the power generation system compared to, say, natural gas or biogas. So I understand that Bloom Energy fuel cells are somewhat fuel flexible in terms of the energy, in terms of the fuel that they're utilizing to generate electricity. And so, Tanya, I wonder if you can put in context for us how Bloom's technology solution fits into the power system compared to incumbents. In my mind, it's a good comparison to incumbents like a natural gas peaker plant that only get used a part of the time. It's not used for base load, or maybe like a diesel backup generator, or there might be better comparisons in your mind than mine. And I'm just wondering if you can put that in context for us.
Sure, thank you, Paul. Happy to do that. So just a little background information. Bloom's fuel cells are solid oxide fuel cells, and they provide baseload power. So they're always on. And a primary characteristic is that there's no, and this is of all fuel cells, is that there isn't any combustion. And so what that means is that the criteria pollutants, the NOx and the particulate matter pollutants, are very low. And then the carbon emissions depend on the fuel that's used that's put into the fuel cell to create the electricity. So Bloom's fuel cells can run on natural gas, they can run on biogas, they can run on hydrogen, or they can run on blends of methane and hydrogen. And so if they're running on biogas or clean hydrogen, the carbon emissions can be negative or zero. And if they're on natural gas, it's low carbon emissions. A key, I'd like to put fuel cells in the context, and John referred to this a little bit, this whole idea of clean, firm power and what that means. And that's what fuel cells can provide. And what clean, firm power means is that it's a generating asset that's not dependent on weather, like wind and solar, very important renewable resources, and among the most cost-effective, not the most cost-effective. And but they're not. They are weather dependent, And then also clean firm power doesn't have the capacity restrictions like batteries have. Batteries can only provide power to the extent that they have been able to charge from the grid usually, so that then they can provide that power back. So fuel cells provide this very important asset to provide clean firm power. And we know that as we see increasing amounts of variable renewable electricity on the grid, this need is growing significantly. And so just an example, looking at the California power grid to make this point. So on April 29th, about 2:30 in the afternoon, California, which is fifth largest economy in the world, the percentage of renewable electricity on the grid was 95%, which is really significant in just for a few minutes, but it got to almost 100%, really exciting. But then when you look at a 24/7, 365 basis, it is a much different story. And so I looked at 4 a.m. this morning as what the mix of electricity on the California grid was, and the share of renewables was just under 15%. Natural gas was really the largest share, and that was 39.2%. And then there was grid power, which is usually primarily natural gas at 32.7%, nuclear 11%, large hydro at 2.1%, and coal at 0.1%. And so all to say that this goal that California and many other states have of 100% renewable and clean energy, to get that on a 24/7, 365 basis, unless you're in a place that has abundant hydroelectric resources, the only way you can really do that is with technologies such as fuel cells that provide this clean, firm power. And then in addition to helping meet climate and clean energy goals, increasingly we're seeing in the US that reliability and resiliency are an issue, particularly for facilities such as data centers, hospitals, large retailers that really can't afford to have the power go off because of that, manufacturing facilities, because if they do, they end up with significant cost impacts. And what we've seen in the US is that since between 2000 and 2019, we've seen a 67% increase in major power outages for longer periods of time due to weather-related events. And in California, we're all too familiar with public safety power shutoffs, which is what happens if there's a risk of fire due to weather events. And that's extremely disruptive to the economy. And so what has been happening, back to your question about alternatives, is that people are taking reliability into their own hands, and there's been a proliferation of backup diesel generators, which of course have environmental, carbon, and significant air quality impacts very much on disadvantaged communities. So that's a trend that is growing and quite alarming, and something that fuel cells can really provide a good alternative to. And then in terms of combined cycle natural gas generation, certainly there's a lot of work being done at replacing the natural gas with clean fuels, be it biomethane or increasingly hydrogen. The thing about fuel cells, again, is that it's a non-combustion technology, just making it inherently cleaner, particularly from an air quality perspective. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tanya. That was really helpful. And there's some great thoughts there about the resiliency that the grid itself needs to provide to customers, and how people are, as you mentioned, managing that in more and more on just the individual residential basis by putting in fossil fuel resources like diesel gensets. I'm thinking now a number of years back about how much solar took off in California to start getting toward those 95% numbers that you talked about, even if just briefly. But to back up the intermittencies of those and the so-called duck curve that a lot of us, were monitoring and looking at solutions for at the time, at least initially, California was investing more in just natural gas production. So natural gas electricity production. So I know that as we look at the intermittencies of wind and solar, that there is a role that hydrogen can play here in turning that very variable kind of power output into more like a renewable base load. And the solution there is energy storage. And electrical energy storage is something that is becoming more and more part of the conversation right alongside renewables. And there are a lot of great national lab reports that talk about how energy storage works and how hydrogen can act as an energy storage asset in that regard. John, I wonder if you can expand a little bit on ways in which hydrogen is fitting into that energy storage portfolio, and how that will actually, if it's done the right way, help green the grid, help the grid allow it to have more renewables without impacting reliability in that way.
Sure. Yeah. So the way that I see this really working out is that there's a lot of lithium-ion batteries installed for most of the daily energy balancing needs. So in a typical day, you'll have a lot more, at least in California as an example, a lot more solar production than you can actually consume. You'll charge up your lithium-ion batteries and you'll discharge them. The problem becomes, you'll have these periods, in particular in the winter, where you won't have much solar and you won't have much wind for multiple days on end. And so given the fact that there's lower round trip efficiency, for using power to gas back to a fuel cell or a combustion turbine, than there is with lithium-ion batteries. You won't use them for most of the time, but when you really do need this power, that's, I think, a really valuable source or a really valuable resource for keeping the grid reliable. And so one way you could think about this would be you'd have a bunch of electrolyzers that were tied to the grid, located near places where you could store hydrogen underground. In the spring, in particular, when you have a lot of this overgeneration that was just mentioned, you can, turn your electrolyzer on midday, make some hydrogen, put it underground. You repeat that over and over and over again, and then come during periods where you don't have enough energy in the tank of your lithium-ion battery fleet, you can then start to consume that hydrogen and turn it into electricity. Again, I want to emphasize that, most of the time you're not going to use it because it's more expensive to do that from a round-trip efficiency standpoint than to use lithium-ion batteries. But a really interesting thing is if you have this source of long-duration energy storage or some form of clean power, you can really reduce the required amount of wind, solar, and batteries you need to put on the grid to deliver 100% clean energy. So really, it's sort of looking at this sort of portfolio effect where you use hydrogen when you really, really need it, and that can actually help keep total system costs low. And again, this is, I think, a study that's been shown across multiple different geographies, from multiple different modeling tools, and sort of multiple different scenarios where really you want something you can turn on when you need it. Most of the time you're going to be using wind, solar, and batteries.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful. And that echoes some of the discussion that we have up at New York Best about how energy storage, when deployed the right way and across different timescales, there's definitely a growing portfolio of that energy storage. But if you're deploying that energy storage the right way, it really reinforces the investments that we're making in wind and solar, as that really helps them act as a much more dispatchable resource on the grid, which is what we need to see. All right, thank you. I think we're going to shift over a little bit into some Q&A that we're getting. There's a lot of great discussion happening in the background on the chat. And so I'll give my panelists a minute or two to gather their thoughts around some questions. I'm going to throw one out shortly here about water. And we've talked some about electrolysis, and some concerns and questions have come in around how do you think about deploying electrolysis at scale in different parts of the country where water resources are not equal across the country. I'm thinking here about myself. I reflect on the Northeast versus the Southwest, of course, is one extreme example of that. And then related to that, there was a question around seawater. Is there technology out there to begin using seawater to electrolyze? And I know directly if you do that, you get hydrogen plus chlorine, just from the chemistry, and that's a lot of the way that chlorine is made here in the Northeast. But are there ways that people are looking at adapting that to make hydrogen and oxygen, or to extract the hydrogen from the seawater? I'll open it up to whoever wants to comment on that question.
I can start from the fuel cell perspective. Fuel cells using hydrogen, and then kick it over to someone else to answer the electrolysis side. Fuel cell systems are water neutral. So you put some water in when they start up, and because they operate continuously, they don't require any additional water going into the system. Now, one of their byproducts is steam, but it's more of a regenerative system when it comes to water. And I do remember a statistic from Doosan, formerly UTC Power, that one of their 400 kilowatt systems being installed can save 1 million gallons of water a year, as compared to the same level of generation from a natural gas combined cycle plant.
That's a big number. That's fantastic context. On the electrolysis side, John, do you have any context there? I know a little bit about it. I can comment myself, but I want to see if others have additional background on thinking about other ways to make hydrogen other than electrolysis. For example, if you're in the Southwest, or how much water electrolysis really does require on a per kilogram basis to make the hydrogen.
Sure. I believe the number, and I'm trying to recall a presentation that I was reviewing a couple of weeks ago. I believe the number is it's about 2.5 gallons of water consumed per kilogram of hydrogen. Again, a kilogram of hydrogen has a lower heating value of about 33 kilowatt hours for all my energy nerds that are in attendance and want to do some calculation on the side. I would say the thought that I have on this one is any electrolysis system is going to require pretty heavy amounts of purification of the water supply, and so as a result of that, it might be that you could use water from either say saline aquifers that are not used for drinking water or some sort of wastewater. I think that could potentially be leveraged for the generation of hydrogen. Seawater, I think you're absolutely right, Paul. You wouldn't want to make chlorine gas, at least unless you really intended to do so in an industrial facility. But, again, you could consider some sort of process by which you remove sodium and chloride from the input stream. My overall thinking is, though, I guess just a couple things. First is really you should emphasize on using water that's not for, agricultural or human consumption. And I think second of all, you should consider this fact that, say, if you're in, Los Angeles, you're making, let's say some future world, you're making hydrogen north of Los Angeles, you're piping it in. Well, you are kind of moving water via pipe. And once you turn it into, power, you are making water again. And so if you're using a fuel cell in particular, it's almost like a means of transporting that water, albeit indirectly. I do think the issue is real, but I think that there's ways to work around it. In particular, keeping in mind that you're going to have to purify the water regardless. You can't just use tap water in an electrolyzer. And so that kind of opens up some windows that don't increase cost that much to use supplies of water that wouldn't otherwise be used for human or agricultural consumption.
Thanks. Those are really helpful. The other consideration I remember, and I really need to get better about remembering these statistics, and so I'll not put a judgment out there either way, but just a reminder to look up the numbers on how much water it takes to make a gallon of gasoline, because that's not a zero number there either. And there are a lot of refineries in California that are already using water in that industrial process. All right. I want to make sure I didn't step on any other comments about that question before we move on to another one. Good. Tanya?
I think it's pretty well covered.
Okay, great. I saw you come off mute, so I wanted to make sure I didn't step on anything. Encouragement to the audience to bring in more questions if you have some. We have an interesting one here about the status today and the current conditions, if you will, in the industry. What is stopping the world right now from leveraging hydrogen to its full potential? And this question came in specifically in the power generation industry.
I can start that. Oh,
go ahead, Katrina.
Okay, I'll start it, and then I definitely think both of you will have input as well. So hydrogen hasn't really been incentivized to date. So that's another reason that this Infrastructure Act is huge. It's creating some incentives, and it's creating these federal level standards that will be pushed down to the state level. And I think even just having this level of investment at the federal level will help for the states to include hydrogen in their decarbonization pathways, because it's still been under debate here. To date, the really large electrolysis demonstrations have been in Europe, in Asia, even some of the like 50 megawatt scale hydrogen-based fuel cell system, that's in Korea. So the fact that there have been very consistent incentives into other energy technologies, but not into fuel cells and hydrogen, they've undergone different levels of support, different stop-start cycles. It's really, I think, complicated the economics for a nascent technology, and whereas other technologies had long-term, 20, 30-year scaled subsidies. So that's, I think, an intro thought into that subject.
I think that's a great intro. And I think it's also why the DOE Hydrogen Hubs opportunity is so exciting, to aggregate these different off-takers in different sectors. So these are the new end uses for hydrogen, not the existing ones, and to decarbonize in particular industries like steel and shipping, and long-haul transportation and electricity generation that are new uses of clean hydrogen and do need policy support in order to be able to become cost effective. That's really the answer, would be the cost and also the supply of green hydrogen. As I mentioned before, 96% of the hydrogen that's being produced today is gray hydrogen from natural gas and coal. And so we just need clear signals from governments to de-risk the construction of green hydrogen production facilities, and to send clear signals to off-takers that the decarbonization is going to be key to their future. And so that's what the Hydrogen Hub opportunity does, and I think it'll make a big difference.
I would add to these thoughts that infrastructure is a big issue. Hydrogen doesn't have very much energy density on a volumetric basis, so that amount of energy per unit volume is low. It's similar to natural gas in that regard. The natural gas grid is as it looks because that's the lowest cost means to deliver a gaseous fuel. There's a study that should be in the notes for this talk that we did with Mitsubishi Hydrogen, where they kind of basically circumvented that issue by literally building an electrolysis facility directly over an underground facility in which you can store hydrogen. If you're going to use this at large scale, you need these early anchor tenants and then a nascent pipeline system in order to do this. There's a reason why there's no natural gas plant out there that stores natural gas on site. They get it delivered by pipeline. So you have to think intelligently about where can we generate hydrogen, store it underground, because above ground or local storage is very expensive in either gaseous or liquid state, and then deliver it to the power plants. And so that's, I think, really pretty critical. And there is some opportunity to replace or basically repurpose some of the existing natural gas infrastructure for the movement of hydrogen, but it's really, there's some challenges associated with that, and you'd really kind of have to go from very small blends to pretty full-on hydrogen in order to not incur multiple different sets of infrastructure upgrade costs.
Thanks, everyone. That's a great segue into a pair of questions. One comes from the students, I think, who organized this group, and they were asking about that infrastructure, the current power generation infrastructure that generates electricity from natural gas is what I'm thinking, and both the pipeline and the turbines that generate the electricity. What is the scenario look like for being able to blend hydrogen into that existing infrastructure? I know that Europe is exploring that to an extent right now. There was a ruling just here in New York State at the end of October that a proposal for doing exactly that at the Danskammer power plant downstate, they were denied a permit from the New York State DEC. Well, my little bit of looking into that specific point was related to the NOx emissions, which I guess have a risk of increasing as we move from natural gas to hydrogen. So with those kind of context in mind about pipeline generation and impacts, can we talk for a minute or two about what that transition looks like and what are the technology steps, or is it just really cost of retrofitting and we already know how to do it?
I want to clarify before my colleagues respond that ruling from the DEC in New York was on the combustion of hydrogen. So if you used that hydrogen in fuel cell systems, it's non-combustion and there would not be the NOx emissions.
That's a really important distinction. Thanks, Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
And I can jump in on the issue of blending hydrogen to existing natural gas pipelines. As you mentioned, Paul, there's a lot of work being done around the world on that. And the general, so sort of without significant impacts on the infrastructure and on end uses, 5% is probably a rule of thumb, although every natural gas operator is going to want to test the impact on their specific system. But that work is being done, and there's a lot of interest in that as a way to utilize existing infrastructure to transport clean fuels. On the turbine side, I know many turbine manufacturers, Mitsubishi in particular, they have turbines that can take 30% hydrogen today and working on 100% hydrogen blends. I think the project John was referring to was the Intermountain Power Project in Utah, and they're working on that. That's the combination of electrolytic hydrogen storage in salt caverns and then transporting that to the power plant. And working, the goal is to get to 100% hydrogen, displacing all of the natural gas. And that previously was actually a coal plant. So it's from coal to natural gas to hydrogen. So the short answer, a lot of work is being done on that. And I think there is a lot of potential. There is, of course, the NOx issues, and work is being done to see what can be done to abate those emissions.
I would just add that it seems that maybe there are some existing natural gas power plants where you could do that retrofit, and that cost might not be that high. We're really looking into trying to get better numbers there. Public Service Company of New Mexico recently put out an integrated resource plan, which is essentially a look at how they're going to build their system out to the future to meet their carbon goals. And one of the things they say in there is an option where you basically retrofit an existing GE gas power plant to burn hydrogen. They quote a cost that's really low. It's around 10% of the typical capital cost for these plants. But I think as Tanya really said, it really remains to be seen if that can be done. If that can be done, that's really promising, because then you get rid of some of your stranded asset risks of having these gas plants that currently provide the majority of power in the United States. But I don't think you can do that hydrogen retrofit for each one of them. And the big challenge, is, as Tanya stated, is NOx. Hydrogen burns at high temperatures. The chemistry then can split nitrogen in air and make some oxides of nitrogen. So I think that really is, I think we've definitely covered some pretty interesting aspects of it. But I'm personally very excited by this idea, just because you really need some form of baseload power. This could be one of them, and maybe it's not that expensive to do it, which can help us save that money to decarbonize other sectors besides the power sector.
Okay, thanks.
I would add, Doosan also has a 50 megawatt direct hydrogen power plant in Korea. So again, being demonstrated outside the US, it's possible that we can have hydrogen substations with fuel cell systems. And they're very energy dense, so they have a much smaller footprint than other alternatives as well.
Yes, something that we've talked around a little bit here, but haven't gotten into the details of, and maybe we can address it as we move into one of these last questions coming in about vehicles. But the fact that a fuel cell is not combustion, to me as a chemist, is a very profound statement, which means that you're not just burning something to make steam or to make a vapor change and a fluid expand and then do mechanical work to get electricity, right? That's how natural gas power plants work. That's even how nuclear power plants work. It's basically a mechanical motion to spin a turbine, and you yank electricity out of the turbine. There's no actually electrons in the chemistry that you're doing, that you're managing. Whereas a fuel cell is the opposite. The fuel cell lets you reach down inside the molecule, whether it's hydrogen or natural gas or whatever mix you might be putting in the appropriate fuel cell, and rip the electron right out of that molecule. And that's what makes it a lot more efficient on a single reaction basis as a means of extracting electricity out of a chemical fuel. And so in addition to the emissions benefits, it also has that higher efficiency. And that I think is playing out a little bit, especially in the mobility space and the transportation space, but also has implications for power sector. This comment came in about hydrogen-powered automobiles, and will they be able to compete with electric vehicles? So it's a little bit now a flip of the efficiency question, and we're moving over from gasoline to hydrogen, and also asking about electric vehicles based on batteries. When are they expected to be competitive with the electric vehicles? And I might expand that question as a moderator. We can talk about it in different classes and not just in passenger vehicles.
Who wants to jump in and take that?
I'll let you start this time, Tanya.
Well, I would just say, start looking at different use cases. There's certainly a lot of potential for in the heavy duty classes, 8 and 9 trucks and above, where the weight of batteries would be limiting, and then also the charge time if they're long haul trucks. So I think that's a very promising sector. And then for medium and lighter duty vehicles, I honestly think it's an area where we need to have both options available, and we let the market decide. I mean, not everybody's going to be able to have home charging, which is what makes EVs so convenient for people who do have that ability. The fact that the fueling experience between hydrogen and gasoline is so similar, I think that there's going to be a segment of the population that's going to prefer that option to battery electric vehicles. So my feeling is that we're going to have the most success in decarbonizing transportation, which in many places is 50% of the carbon emissions, places like California. And picking winners and losers is not going to be a long-term productive strategy, but others might have other views.
In addition, in the material handling segment, where Plug Power is the dominant player, they have hundreds of thousands of fuel cell electric vehicles, and those compete both with combustion engines and with batteries because of that refueling experience primarily. When they're being used at warehouses, other facilities, it's very easy for a driver, an operator, to just simply drive up and refuel their own system versus having to wait in line to change out a battery. That's been a really big driver for the adoption of companies like Amazon and Walmart of this fuel cell technology for more of those commercial and industrial operations.
I would echo the comments here. The heavier the thing is, the farther it has to go, the better the application. I'm not very bullish on light duty vehicles, but I have certainly thought things very strongly about, the energy decarbonization process and been proved wrong. So I think time will tell. But big, heavy things that need to go a long distance, that's where you want to use hydrogen and where it will compete favorably with electrification.
That's fantastic. Thank you for those comments. I think that the take home for me on that transportation question echoes a big take home in the energy storage discussion and in the power generation discussion, is that hydrogen and fuel cells have some really interesting opportunities to become one of the members of the portfolio of each of those different categories, right? Our electricity system today is not monolithic. We don't make electricity with any one technology. We have a portfolio of technologies out there. And I expect, looking forward at our transportation system, at our energy storage system, and at our power generation system, that portfolio situation will continue, and that hydrogen and fuel cells have an excellent place to play in each one of those three portfolios. So I wanted to thank everyone who is listening in today, thank the Cornell Energy Connection for putting this together, and most of all, really thank all of the panelists today, Katrina, Tanya, and John. Thank you all for joining me in this discussion.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
It's